Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Songbird Habitat and Biodiversity Mapping in the Missinaibi Forest webinar. Uh, this webinar is being hosted by Mushkegowuk Council Lands Resources Department in collaboration with Wren, who is a master's student with Algoma University, who will be giving talk about their research. Um, for those who don't know me, my name is Hope Hill, and I am the Carbon and Biodiversity Project Coordinator with Mushkegowuk Council. So I will be here today to moderate the webinar. This webinar will be recorded, so if you would like to refer back to it later, or if people who weren't able to attend, they'll be able to refer to it later. It will be hosted on our Land and Resources Facebook page and our YouTube channel. So yeah, uh, we will also be having a question and answer period at the end of your presentation. So feel free to type your questions in the chat, or when the time comes for the question and answer period, feel free to unmute yourself and raise your hand to ask your question. But with that, I think I'll just pass it to Ryan. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Hope, for the introduction. Let me get sharing my screen here.
Sorry, you're muted, Ryan.
Sorry, it was giving me an issue with sharing computer audio and my audio at the same time that time.
Yeah, no worries.
Let's try
We can
this
try
one more
again.
time. We practiced this beforehand, and of course we're going to get an error with this when... still doesn't like it. Strange. Huh. Sorry, Hope. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay.
Hmm. It's not liking sharing your audio and the presentation's audio, or is that what
Yeah,
it's?
it worked. It worked before.
Yeah.
It gives me a message saying that I'm muted when I share the system audio.
Okay.
I'm gonna have to proceed without it because I don't know
All
how to
right.
fix this immediately here. So, unfortunately, you won't get to hear some of the little bird songs in there, but we can go without that. Okay, let's try this now. Okay, now you can see me and hear me.
Yeah.
Sorry for the delay. Wonderful. Okay, and let's get into it then. So, as Hope mentioned, my name's Wren Coxson. I'm a master's student at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie, and I'll be talking with you today about some of my research using emerging technologies to understand local songbird habitat use and developing new tools to address biodiversity loss in managed forests. There'll be slide numbers in the top right here. If anyone wants to refer to those, if they have a question they think of for the end, go ahead. So I'll start zoomed out here. The green on this map is showing the extent of the boreal forest zone in North America. Covers almost a third of the continent and provides most of the breeding habitat for more than 100 species of birds. This project and a lot of my prior work has taken place in the boreal, so I was going to start from this map to introduce myself and the work I'm doing right now before I dive into the science. I grew up here in BC on Lheidli territory in Prince George, BC. I come from a settler Canadian ancestry, and when I was growing up in BC, I had a lot of access to wild spaces that shaped an interest in birds and nature from a very young age. I completed my undergraduate training in BC in chemistry and environmental science and followed that to a career of about 6 years working in environmental consulting in Treaty 8 territory in Northeast BC. I was working there with water, soils, plants, and wildlife. And through that time, gradually refocused my professional interest on birds and ecology. And then before moving over here to start the master's, I also spent a season working with a nonprofit in the central Yukon. I was working with them to try and understand bird habitat use in landscapes disturbed by mining. And finally, I'm queer, which I add because it's still June, and because I think that's shaped a lot of the perspectives I've built as I've created this career in natural resources and ecology. So that brings me to my current work here. For a year now, I've been living in Anishinaabe territory at Bawating, Sault Ste. Marie, and I've been conducting research in the boreal on the lands of the Missinaibi Cree and Chapleau Cree First Nations to the north of me. My master's project is part of a larger collaborative project aiming to use LiDAR tools to improve sustainable forest management. I'll get into what LiDAR is later if you're not familiar with it, not to worry. This is a 2-year project. I'm about halfway through it right now with supervision from Algoma University and from the Ontario Forest Research Institute, which is run by the MNR here in Sault Ste. Marie. And I'm happy to have other project partners to draw on, including Mushkegowuk Council's Lands and Resource Department and remote sensing specialists at York University. So all of these areas I've worked in across the boreal share a lot of ecological similarities. The plant communities are dominated by cold-tolerant trees like white spruce and jack pine. These maps on the left here show the ranges of these trees outlined in black, with the boreal zone in gray beneath it. So these kind of trees provide habitat for some year-round resident birds in the boreal, like this boreal chickadee here. Here's where I've got sound, if it was working, unfortunately. And you can see the range of this bird here in purple across the boreal. You might be familiar with them as a winter feeder visitor in our area. But most of our local breeding birds aren't hardy enough to survive the local winters, so they migrate. I've got a few different tree species shown on the left here, and an example of a short distance migrant. This one, the winter wren, is an early arrival here in the spring. They show up when there's still snow on the ground. They are a little bit of a tough bird to see in the understory and around fallen logs, but they have a really beautiful song, which in an ideal world I'd love to share, but I don't think the sound is going to work. I will try it just in case. So quite a few of our birds make this kind of short distance migration. The winter wren moves from breeding habitat in red on this map down through a migration range in yellow to migrate to winter in the blue area in the southeastern United States. And a lot of them stop there, but many of our birds go a lot further for the winter. This is an example of a long-distance migrant, the Blackburnian warbler. They, along with many of our other birds, migrate all the way down to Central and South America for the winter before coming back to breed each summer in the boreal. They travel tens of thousands of kilometers throughout their lives. This species is pretty common in mixed wood forests here. They use broadleaf trees like the trembling aspen, up in the boreal, and also more southerly trees like sugar maple that are reaching their northern range up around my study area. So All of these birds and many more are able to coexist in the boreal by using different parts of the forest's three-dimensional structure. The birds in this diagram on the right are all from the same family. These are what's called wood warblers. And there's a lot of studies going back more than 60 years showing how closely related species in this family are able to coexist using different parts of even the same tree. This is a more recent paper expanding on that with this diagram showing a bunch of different species and their preferred foraging niches with different heights in the tree and different distances from the tree's trunk. And what this paper showed is actually that this diversity of structural habitat preferences is what has driven the adaptive radiation of so many bird species in our area. So without that forest structure diversity, we wouldn't have as many birds today as we have. This is a photo, which is also my background photo right now, from near Chapleau. And we can see kind of the same aspects of forest structural diversity here as was illustrated in that diagram. And many of those same warbler species use this forest. We have some using the tops of the spruce tree in the back, some using the aspen canopy, and some using these lower shrubs. So forest structure is clearly really important for biodiversity in our area. So what happens if we start to lose some of that structural diversity? This is what more recent research has started to refer to as forest degradation. So the study on the right was conducted in Atlantic Canada, and it was looking into how different types of forest cover impact bird habitat use in the region. We can see in that plot on the bottom, we've got the red total forest cover increasing slightly over the past 30 years in that region. But the forest that actually provides habitat for those selected birds has been declining. And this is because a lot of the older, more structurally complex forests that provide habitat for many of our forest specialist species are becoming less common as we get more widespread industrial timber harvest in the region. And this is the pattern across most of the southern boreal, where we have a lot of timber harvest happening. And we know from papers like this that this is contributing to declines in birds. And it's especially important for ones like our long distance migrants that have to face a lot of other threats throughout their life cycle. The forest dwelling long distance migrant birds as a group have declined by 17% since 1970. And we know this pattern is taking place across the boreal. Industrial forest harvest has largely replaced fire as the dominant disturbance mechanism in these forests. And modern forest management typically aims to try and recreate patterns of natural disturbance, the fire, putting natural in air quotes, since we know fire was also used for forest management by First Nations in pre-colonial times. But there's a lot of research showing that the bird communities that use forests following fire and harvest can be quite different. There's different structural components of the habitat and different trees and shrubs that come back following fire and following harvest. These are all pictures from our area. The fire is one near White River. That clear cut is one near Chapleau. And some of the research that's coming out of my lab at Algoma actually is indicating that it takes anywhere from 40 to 60 years for bird communities to converge to become similar as these two types of forests regenerate following disturbance. And zooming out a bit to the landscape scale, we know that there's both less older forest on the landscape and different patterns of patches. So this map on the right here is showing cumulative forest loss over the past 25 years, with green areas being forest harvest and brown being fire disturbance. Zooming out a bit more to this map, we can see I've added in an orange layer here that indicates the extent of the managed forest zones in Ontario and Quebec. And overall, Ontario's boreal forest has lost about 20% of its area to logging since 1976. And this is all regenerated. Forest area is about constant. but most of the remaining older forest, and particularly large areas of older forest, is in the far north. So we've got a different landscape in the southern boreal than would have been present in pre-colonial times. And this is likely to continue to be the case. We're not going to see less timber harvest in the foreseeable future. So in order to address biodiversity loss in this landscape, we need to understand how changes in forest structure at small scales, like the birds using different parts of this tree, impact the distribution and populations of these birds across large landscapes, like this whole boreal area of Ontario in the map behind. Doing research across this range of scales is a really difficult task, and until recently, it's been nearly impossible to gather the kinds of data that we would need to do this. But that has been changing. And over the last decade or so, we have some emerging technologies that are starting to make it possible. One of these is airborne laser scanning. This is a way to collect detailed three-dimensional views of the forest across large landscape areas. We can see on the left image from the forests in our area showing the aspen canopy and a subcanopy of balsam fir. I've drawn in some trees here to sort of illustrate this. And on the right, those are all the areas that we have this type of data for in Canada. This technology uses LiDAR, which is the same thing that self-driving cars use and many people have on their smartphones now. It works by sending down a little laser pulse from the aircraft, in this case, down toward the ground. That bounces off the vegetation or off the ground and is received by the aircraft. And using those reflected light pulses, we can reconstruct what's called a point cloud, which is this image shown here. Each one of those little green points represents an individual reflection of the LiDAR off of vegetation. And this is a quickly evolving technology. We're now able to capture this data faster, more efficiently, and in more detailed formats than we were before. Ontario is actually at the forefront of this at the moment. Between 2018 and 2025, the province has used a newly developed type of LiDAR called single photon LiDAR to collect among the most detailed LiDAR data sets in Canada across nearly 500,000 square kilometers of its managed forest zone. We can see that on the map here in blue. Ontario's got really dense, high quality LiDAR imagery across its entire managed forest zone at the moment. This represents a massive resource for foresters and conservation planners if we can learn to use it effectively. To use this data for ecology and forestry, we need to reduce some of the complexity of the three-dimensional point cloud images that are collected. We do that by calculating metrics. These describe things like canopy shape or the volume of vegetation in different vertical layers. You can calculate those using three-dimensional boxes like you see on the left of that image, or by taking an average vertical profile of the LiDAR. We can see here that most of the reflections of LiDAR and most of the vegetation in this forest is in that upper aspen canopy layer in this stand, just looking at that average profile on the right. And we can calculate metrics like these across large landscape areas and relate those back to the occurrence patterns of wildlife to understand their habitat needs. But in order to do that, we also need a lot of data for where the wildlife occurs across that landscape. One way to collect that is by using passive acoustic monitoring. This is a great technology for working with birds. We use autonomous recording units, which you can see on the right there, to collect data across large areas with much less effort than would be required for in-person surveys. I've used these for my research. We put them out in our study plots at the beginning of the bird breeding season, come back a few weeks later or a month later and collect them. And we have this really rich data source of recorded bird vocalizations that we didn't have to be there doing point count surveys early in the morning to collect. And this is useful because birds can be a good indicator species for the rest of the broader ecosystem. It's really challenging to survey for things like, say, small mammals across large spatial areas, but we can do it quite easily using bird vocalizations and passive acoustic monitoring, and kind of use that as a proxy for larger ecosystem functioning in the area. Here's what the data looks like. Unfortunately, I can't play it at the moment because of technical issues, but this is a visual representation of one of my recordings. This big spiky part in the center of this plot is a blackbirding and warbler song. You're looking at what's called a spectrogram, which shows the frequency or how high pitched the sound is on the vertical axis and the time on the horizontal axis. And all of those other little blobs and lines in there belong to other bird species singing. So until recently, it's also been a lot of work for us to take these kinds of recordings and spend time going through to sort out all of the individual birds in them to use for our research. But that's also been changing in the last couple of years. We're starting to use machine learning recognizer software that enables us to do this analysis much faster. And in just the last couple of years, it's gotten much, much faster and more reliable than it has been even 5 or 6 years ago. For my research, I'm using what's called BirdNet. It's a software put together by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Chemnitz University of Technology. It works by taking the larger recordings I have, splitting them into little short 3-second segments, comparing that visual spectrogram of the song in that segment with a huge reference library of recordings of all the local bird species, and then giving me a probability score of how likely it thinks one of those birds is to be occurring in that little chunk of the recording. I can then take that data and do a bunch of validation steps on it so that I know how likely we are to get errors in it, and get a really solid data set in much less time than it would have taken me to manually listen to all of the recordings. So I'm using this passive acoustic monitoring technology with automated recognizers along with LiDAR technology to try and answer 3 main research questions. I want to test Ontario's new LiDAR dataset as a tool for songbird habitat modeling. I want to test the strengths and limitations of this data and find out how well LiDAR metrics can predict bird occurrence on the landscape. I'm trying to improve the power of this data by developing niche-focused metrics. This means taking some of those measures of the LiDAR point cloud in the image below, and then tweaking the way they're calculated to be specific to the life history traits of the species I'm looking at. My second goal is to use this with a small set of songbird species to learn more about their habitat use in our local context and produce really detailed habitat use maps. This is an example from an earlier study that shows the kind of habitat mapping I'm hoping to produce. We can see here at a really fine spatial scale of sort of tens of kilometers on this map, you can see a higher probability of that bird occurring along these little creek valleys here. So I'm hoping I can produce this kind of detailed songbird habitat mapping in the Missinaibi region. My third goal is to understand how the fine scale habitat and large scale habitat features interact. So for example, are these LiDAR derived measures of forest structural features like how dense are the trees still a good predictor of occurrence when only small forest patches are available or when there's a lot of other disturbance on the landscape? You can see an image at the bottom of one of my study sites with increasing areas around that study site. You can see all kinds of different disturbance starting to appear as you get out to 500 meters or a kilometer from it. This is my study area. So I'm working within the Missinaibi Forest Management Unit, aligned in black, around the communities of Chapleau, Missinaibi, and Dubreuilville. I have 96 study plots in the area, which are all located in existing forest vegetation research plots maintained by the MNR. And for this reason, we have a solid background of field habitat data for them. I supplemented that with a few more vegetation recordings last year in the field and recorded birds at all of them during June of last year. We have LiDAR data across this entire region that was collected by aircraft flights in 2021 and 2022. I've tried to choose study plots that have a mix of harvest or fire stand origins. You can see in the red or the yellow on these points on the map. And also choose ones that have a good mix of forest types and ages to get a good representation of our forest habitats in the region. Here's a few of my focal species that I'm working with. We have at the top a Blackbirdian warbler, which uses emergent tree crowns for singing, so I might be able to see some of that in the LiDAR data. Brown creeper, which is a small songbird that forages on dead and dying tree bark for bugs. And then at the bottom, a veery, which is a thrush that uses dense shrubs in forest openings or in younger forests. All of these have really diverse habitat preferences, and I've chosen them to try and test the limits of the LiDAR data, see where it's useful and where it's maybe not as useful. Here's some preliminary data from these showing the distribution of them in all of my study plots in the area, where those like red dots are areas where we've got a lot of recordings of them showing up in the database. And we can see just looking at those maps without getting too into them that they're pretty different distributions across the area. So then my question to work with is what structural habitat features might be driving those different distributions, and can I see them with the LiDAR? I'm just starting to get into this, and I can show you some preliminary results from it here. This is back to this brown creeper. Here's a picture of them. Very cute, small songbird, forages mostly on bark, uses larger dead and dying trees. And I know this plot is a lot to look at, but I'll go through it slowly. It is a heat map showing the relationship between the calculated value of different metrics and the probability of finding this bird in a forest with that metric value. So each vertical column is a different LiDAR-derived metric showing different aspects of the forest at my study sites. Some of them describe forest height, some of them describe how variable the canopy height is, some describe the density of understory. Each row in this is a different spatial scale, so it's just a recalculation of that LiDAR metric at a different area around my study plot from 50 meters out to half a kilometer. The slopes are the important part. We can see the ones in red indicate that we have more creepers present in areas where there's a higher value of that metric. And blue is the opposite. There's going to be less creepers where there's a higher value of that metric. Bolded ones just mean that that relationship between the metric and the bird is statistically significant. So let's look at one of these squares here. This is a metric called entropy, or Shannon entropy, calculated at a scale of 100 meters around my study plots. Entropy is just a measure of how spread out the vegetation is in vertical layers. So we can see in this image of an aspen forest with a balsam fir understory and LiDAR that most of that vegetation and most of the LiDAR data is reflected from the aspen canopy. So this one might have a fairly low entropy score because that vertical profile of vegetation is pretty clustered in one canopy layer. Here's what the relationship looks like for brown creepers. We can see as the value of that entropy metric increases, we have a higher probability of finding brown creepers in that forest. I'll show you some examples of what these kind of plots look like. This is one where we didn't have any brown creepers. This is a plot with fairly low entropy. It's a young jack pine stand to the east of Chapleau. It's got a fairly uniform canopy cover and not a lot of understory. So it scores low for that Shannon entropy measure. And we didn't have any creepers there. Here's a different one. This is a forest stand up to the north of Chapleau. It's got some taller trees and a lot more diversity of vegetation heights in that forest. So it has a much higher entropy value, and we did find creepers there. So these are the kind of relationships we're looking at. We're just seeing, as we calculate this one measure of the forest that only tells us one little part about what the forest looks like, how does that change how likely we are to find birds? That's what this big heat map grid of different metrics is telling us. This is a different species. This is winter wren again. You saw them earlier. We can see right away in this one, there's not very many strong relationships here. Most of those slopes of relationships are near zero. But we do have one that comes out as significant. This is a metric called rumple index. We calculate that just by looking at how rough is the canopy surface layer. If there's a lot of up and down at the top of the canopy, then we would have a high rumple index. This canopy here in the example is pretty uniform in height, so it would score low. And here's that relationship. Again, we have an increase in the probability of finding this bird at sites with a higher index. Here's an example of one with a pretty low rumple index, similar to that initial aspen stand I showed you, which is just more zoomed in. This is zoomed out to that 50-meter scale at one of my plots. Pretty uniform cover. No winter wrens here. And this one, we do have a high rumple index, which sort of reflects those canopy openings that you can see in the LiDAR data. You can see there's lots of gaps between the trees. And I think that we're seeing more winter wrens in these kind of sites because those openings are often going to be associated with fallen trees, which winter wrens really like to forage around fallen trees and in the shrubs that come up in those openings. So that's the kind of relationships I'm looking for in this data. Here's a set of 4 focal species I'm working with this kind of data shown. Both of those ones on the left are understory birds. We have winter wren and veery, which is a thrush using low shrubs. And we can see for both of them that the occurrence of those birds is not being well predicted by most of these LiDAR metrics. And we do see a couple of relationships. Like we discussed with winter wren, they have that positive relationship with rumple index. For veery, we see a negative relationship with this calculated metric describing how open the understory is, which makes sense. They like shrubs, so if the understory is really open, we're not going to find them there. But overall, this story is sort of indicating that it's harder to get a handle on habitat use for birds that use the understory, which makes sense. The LiDAR doesn't do as good a job seeing this below the forest canopy in some cases, and a lot of these metrics I'm starting to calculate here are more focused toward the upper canopy. On the right side, we've got brown creeper and black Burnian warbler, both like mid to upper canopy birds. What I've circled here are metrics describing how high the trees are. So they're both likely to be found in areas with tall trees. And they're both likely to be found in areas with really diverse vegetation heights, so really complex forests, which are these 2 circled metrics here. There's a few differences between them. We can see that brown creeper, like the winter wren, seems to occur more frequently at areas with a higher rumple index. I think that comes back to the same thing. They like dead and dying trees. When those trees fall, they create openings, and that's reflected in the LiDAR data with the rumple index. One interesting thing is this relationship here. We get a really positive relationship between blackbird and warbler occurrence and openness of the understory. I'm not actually sure why this one is. I'll have to look into it a bit more. So the next steps for me will be here to use these preliminary tests to develop more niche-focused metrics for these birds. I want to test more metrics than the ones you see here. These are all kind of commonly used ones that people calculate for forestry purposes. I want to try a few more, and I want to look at these relationships I've been showing you to refine them in ways that do a really precise job of predicting these birds' occurrence. And then I also want to test them against field data. So we have all this vegetation data from our field plots. I want to see if the LiDAR is as good as that. Maybe it's not as good. I'm hoping it's much better. And eventually, in another year, when I finish this degree, I'm hoping that we can have a habitat mapping process using LiDAR data that's easily reproduced for any species in the recording data set we have, and some really detailed habitat mapping for these birds in the Missinaibi region across the whole forest management unit I showed on the map. And this will hopefully be a good resource for conservation planning, looking at where these birds occur on the landscape, and potentially be something we can use as a layer in the forest resource inventory for mapping and planning harvest areas. And finally, if we can understand what specific structural features are important for local biodiversity, we can modify management practices to promote development of those structural features, and by doing so, improve biodiversity in managed forest landscapes. Thanks for listening through this whole thing. I hope I didn't lose too many people in all those details at the end. I do want to say a quick thank you to all of the project funders and partners. The funding for this project comes from Canada's Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council and from Algoma University. I have some great project partners that I've been drawing on for a lot of questions from time to time, and the project wouldn't have been possible at all without a lot of technical and field support from my research labs, the Oven at Algoma University and Terrestrial Systems Ecology Research Program at the MNR. I'll leave you on this slide here. If anyone's interested in learning more about these topics, this slide has some really useful websites and scientific papers to get you started. And my email's there. If you want to reach out and chat, I'm always happy to talk more about LiDAR. I think I
Great.
accidentally unshared my screen, so I can reshare that if people want to look at slides for questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Wren, for the presentation. Really interesting research. So thank you. Yeah, so with that, we'll open it up to if anyone has any questions or comments they want to share. And feel free to put your question in chat or raise your hand and unmute yourself. We're happy to take questions. Yep, David, go ahead.
That's a great presentation. Thank you very much for sharing all of your research there. It's I find it super fascinating because I've always kind of liked songbirds. So I did have a few questions. Well, three major ones. And I was just writing them down as we were going. What sort of error rates are you seeing in using the machine learning to filter out those bird calls? Like, is it fairly accurate? Is it like
It varies by species. So the way that I treat this data is by taking the initial confidence scores that the machine learning score gives me and then doing manual checks of seeing, well, at a score of like 0.9, how actually likely is it for it to be correct by just taking a bunch of examples from my recording data set. And in doing that, I can choose a level of the score it outputs that gives me a known probability of being correct, essentially. And doing that, we can actually choose like to use either less or more of the results it outputs. So for the species brown creeper and black-burning warbler that you saw on the last slide, it has a bit of a harder time with their songs, and so we need to be a little bit more conservative in which of the selections that the machine learning gives us we can actually use. But because of the way it gives us those with an associated confidence score, we can just choose the ones that have a higher confidence. And in doing so, we know that we're choosing ones that are accurate. For some of them, like the winter wren, it's actually incredibly good at it. Basically, all of the outputs from the machine learning software that it thought were winter wren were winter wren. So it varies by species, but we do have ways for all of the different species of adjusting for that in the data and making sure we're only using correct or at least ones that we have a known error rate on for the science that we do.
And then my other is more of a comment. Sorry, I'm just eating a late lunch as I'm saying this, but
No problem.
as you were talking about like the actual data and those indexes, like the Rumpel index, like I'm just thinking about like maybe it might make some time make sense to devote some time to understanding why some of those populations exist in those lower index areas. So like obviously it's not their main habitat, but they're carving out a niche. Somehow they're existing there in a place that they normally wouldn't. So maybe it would make sense to kind of understand that and how maybe their habitats are shifting to this other spot. So
totally, yeah. It's referring back here, I'll show one thing. Go back up to this bird with the Rumpel index here. So you're looking at this graph, and as you're seeing, like on the top of this, the sites that we do have the bird at, and you can see we do have a lot of lower Rumpel index. You're right. So what that is sort of telling me here is that this particular metric tells part of the story of what they like about their habitat, but it's definitely not everything. And so I'm going to need to test more metrics than that also describe different aspects of the habitat. And I didn't get this in any of these initial ones I tested, so I'm going to need to try a few more. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions for Wren? I don't see anything in the chat, but just give it
I saw one
another.
other hand earlier. I don't know if I answered their question in that.
Oh, yeah, we see Kyle. Okay.
He's typing one.
Yeah.
Okay. He says, what made you choose something like a blackbirdian warbler as opposed to something like a Cape May or black-throated green warbler, which overlaps the same or similar niches? Is it because of how common the species are, or is it easier to identify with BirdNet, with the recognizer? There's a few factors that go into it. So one of the species Kyle mentions, Cape May warbler, is one that feeds a lot of, or almost exclusively in some years, on spruce budworm. So its habitat needs might not be as well reflected in the structure as in the areas where the budworm is this year. So it's not as good of a candidate for this study. And other ones like black-throated green warbler he mentions might also be a great candidate. I might try some of them in the future too. The main reason I've tried the particular warbler, blackbirdian warbler, he suggests or mentions there is it's one that's reasonably common across the whole area. It occupies enough sites that we can get a good sense of what habitats it's using. And also it's one that uses treetops and often sings from emergent tree crowns in the forest. And I wanted to try and get at that habitat feature using LiDAR. So that's why I've chosen that one.
Great. Do we have any other questions?
I'm also happy to take them in future. My email address is on one of the slides here, which you can look back to when this gets posted, or if you're able to take I'll go back to it on my slide deck here if anyone wants to make a note of that to get in touch, because I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. There, I'll leave you with that. Actually, I'll give you one more thing. There is a question that I sort of anticipated. I made a bonus slide for, but no one asked. The LiDAR data that we're working with is publicly available. So we have that across the whole region. You can get it from here. This is Ontario GeoHub. If you go in and search this forest resource inventory, leaf on LiDAR, in the GeoHub website, which I've got linked here, you can find this kind of screen and then click on each of these little 1 kilometer tiles to download it. It'll download as what's called an LAS file, which is just the raw point cloud data. If you want to look at that, a good free viewing software is available here from Cloud Compare. And so just open that download in there, and then you can sort of pan around and have a look at the three-dimensional forest and everything else in these landscapes using that.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Wren.
Yeah, thank you so much for moderating. I appreciate it.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in chat. I'll do one more round. Any questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, in that case, we can wrap things up. Again, thank you so much to Wren for giving this presentation. It's really important, really interesting research. Looking forward to hearing more about the results as you work through them. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining. As I mentioned earlier, and as Wren touched on, this recording will be available on the Mushkegowuk Council Lands and Resources Department Facebook page and YouTube channel. It'll be posted sometime next week or two, so keep your eye out for it. But otherwise, I hope everybody has a good day, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.